Hello, welcome to today's lesson. Today's topic is limited liability complaint. Yes, we'll be looking at the topic limited liability complaint. What is limited liability complaint? It's a complaint formed by people who contribute various sum of money to establish to start the business, and the contribution made by each person is called shares, and these persons are referred to as shareholder. So the limited liability company is owned by shareholders. There are two types of limited liability company. Number one, we have the private liability company and we have the public liability limited liability company. The private limited liability company, it has a minimum of two shareholders and a maximum of 50 shareholders. While the public limited liability company, it can be formed by a minimum of two or seven persons, and there is no limit to the maximum number of shareholders. So from two to infinity, or from two seven to infinity, as many shareholders they can get. And for a company to be formed or incorporated, certain documents must be prepared and submitted to the registrar of companies. And these documents are the memorandum of association. And memorandum of association, it is a document which states the relationship of the company with the outside world, means with every other thing outside the company, people and other organizations and that all. Then also the second document is the articles of association. It is a document which regulates the internal management of the company. So this article of association gives information and it regulates, controls everything that has to do with the company within, not the outside world. All right, so let's move further. What are the classes of shares? Because we mentioned that the people who own the shareholders contribute some amount of money, and those amount of money is called shares. Now, shares are classified into two. We have the ordinary shares and the preference shares. The ordinary shares, the holders of this type of shares are the risk bearer of the company. They are not entitled to a fixed rate of dividends. Dividends are benefits. They receive whatever is left after the preference shareholders have been paid their own dividends. All right. So the what is preference shares? Now, in the preference shares, the holders of this type of shares are paid fixed rates. Listen, I said fixed rates of dividends. Their benefit is fixed. So even though the company make profit or make losses, their benefit is fixed. They are paid first before the ordinary shareholders. The preference share are of two types. They have the accumulative and the participating preference share. Okay, so let's move further. What are the sources of capital for a limited liability company? Or how can they source for capital? Number one is retained profits. At the end of a business period, it can be monthly, it can be quarterly or yearly. At the end, all profit they make, they can decide to put it back into the business without spending them. Then number two ways they can source for capital is sales of new shares. Yes, this company can sell shares to the public. So when the public comes to buy their shares, they have more money, more capital to run their business. Then another source is loans and overdraft from banks. They can apply for a loan, get a loan from bank or an overdraft. Then and lastly, I'll give to you is contributions of members. Every member of the company, the shareholders, can decide to contribute more capital in for the business. Okay, Now, there are advantages of limited liability company. Well, number one advantage is that they can raise more capital. Yeah, more capital. Just for example, a sole proprietorship is a one-man business. He may not be able to raise more capital for the expansion of his business. But in the limited liability company, that the public or the private, they have more persons. Remember, two heads are better than one. All right. Then, secondly, it has a separate legal entity. It has a separate legal entity. I will explain that at the end, towards the end of this lesson. Then, number three, companies can be easily companies can easily absorb losses without failure. When there is a loss in the company or there is a failure in their plan, they can be able to absorb it, to manage it, to handle it without causing closure of the business. The next, large scale production is possible because of its large capital and manpower. Yes, they can produce more things, especially if it's a production company. They can produce more because they can raise more capital and they have enough manpower. And the last I'll give you is the expansion of the business is possible. Yes, if they want to expand the business, move from one level to another, it is very possible because they have enough manpower, they have enough shareholders who can contribute towards achieving that purpose. Then, what are the disadvantages of a limited liability company? Number one disadvantage is that it is usually difficult to form. Yes, because of the various statutory requirements that's requirement by the law that you must oblige to. So it can be very difficult to to establish to form. Then number two, decision making is slow. Decision making it's slow because it's not just one person that owns the business. Before a decision can be arrived at, they have to have a meeting to decide to come to a conclusion. So decision making it's slow. Then number three, no secrecy in the affairs of a company. They can't keep secret. Every limited liability company, as for example, financial and their financial statements, they have to make it public so that people, members of the public, shareholders will be able to see how the company is making progress. But for example, a one-man business, he doesn't need to tell the public or anyone the amount of money he's making, his profit or his losses. Okay, then the next, there is separation of ownership and management. You see, it's a disadvantage. The people who own the business are not the same who runs the business. The owners of the business are shareholders, and those who manage the affairs of the business are boards of directors that are appointed by the shareholders. So you see why this can also lead to slow decision making. Then last disadvantage is that it is expensive to manage because it has to do with so many manpower, persons who are working. It's expensive to manage. Now, take note that a limited liability company has a separate legal entity. Now, that means that the company is different from the owners, the shareholders. So, the company can sue or can be sued in any court of law as an artificial person. So because it has a separate legal entity, it means that if someone has an issue with the company, the person is not having an issue with the owners of the company because the company is an artificial person. So that's what we mean by a separate legal entity. All right, so I believe you've learned something about limited liability company. Thank you for joining in this lesson.